There is a specific breed of terror hidden behind perfectly manicured lawns and aggressively pressure-washed driveways. It is the illusion of absolute control. When people buy into a homeowners association, they believe they are purchasing peace of mind, standardized paint colors, and quiet evenings. What they are actually funding is a suburban micro-dictatorship, typically run by individuals desperate to wield a tiny, unchecked sliver of power. I learned this exactly 4 hours into owning my dream home. The local HOA president thought calling the police on a suspected trespasser would firmly establish her dominance on day one. She didn't realize that by targeting a former corporate risk analyst, she was handing me the exact motivation needed to legally annex the very asphalt she stood on. It all started on a deceptively beautiful, painfully quiet Tuesday afternoon. The heavy metal ramp of my rented moving truck hit the pavement with a loud metallic clang that felt almost offensive in this neighborhood. This was the kind of street where people noticed new arrivals immediately. The streets were pristine. The flower beds were mathematically symmetrical. There was a particular quiet hanging in the air, a community that took deep, borderline obsessive pride in its own atmosphere. It was supposed to be a celebration, the culmination of 11 years of aggressive savings and skipped vacations. As I began hauling boxes, most neighbors who came out to inspect the commotion offered a polite wave or a subtle nod. Normal human behavior. But then there was the woman across the street. She didn't wave. She didn't nod. She stood at the edge of her driveway with her arms tightly crossed, studying every single box, every piece of furniture I unloaded, with an intensity that went far beyond casual neighborhood curiosity. In my former career auditing corporate mergers, I learned to read body language before reading spreadsheets. That stance wasn't curiosity. That was an assessment of threat. Eventually, she marched across the street. She didn't walk. She marched. She introduced herself as Linda Parker, the president of the Homeowners Association. What she did not do was welcome me to the neighborhood. What she did do was launch into a rapid-fire interrogation. What did I do for a living? How long did I plan to stay? Why? Out of all the available properties in the county, had I chosen this particular street? Her tone wasn't conversational. It was a verbal background check. I kept my voice perfectly even. I told her I had recently left a decade-long career as a corporate risk analyst to consult privately. She actually laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. It was a sharp, dismissive exhale. A risk analyst? She looked at my heavily taped moving boxes as if they were infected. So, you sit at a desk and invent problems that don't exist just to justify your paycheck. Well, listen closely. We don't have risks in this neighborhood. We have rules. I highly suggest you focus your analysis on page 4 of the community handbook regarding acceptable grass heights, rather than whatever it is you people do. I didn't flinch. I just smiled politely, wrote it off as territorial small talk energy, and went back to wrestling a remarkably heavy sofa through the front door. 2 hours later, the illusion of a normal moving day shattered. I was pulling the last load from the truck when a police cruiser turned onto the street. It didn't just pass by. It rolled to a slow, deliberate stop and parked directly in front of my house. The red and blue lights weren't flashing, but the presence of the badge was loud enough. 2 officers stepped out. They were professional. They were respectful, but their hands were resting casually near their belts. Someone, they explained in a calm, practiced voice, had reported highly suspicious activity. A possible trespasser breaking into a vacant property. I stood on my own front lawn, sweating through a t-shirt, realizing exactly what was happening. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked them to wait a moment. I walked to the cab of the truck, retrieved my leather binder, and handed them my driver's license, my freshly signed closing documents, and the deed officially registered in my name at the county recorder's office that very morning. The officers reviewed the paperwork in silence. They cross-referenced the names. They looked at the house, looked at me, and sighed. They confirmed I was the legal, undisputed owner of the property. They apologized profusely for the interruption, cited the nature of anonymous dispatch calls, and got back into their cruiser. The entire physical interaction took maybe 8 minutes. But 8 minutes is an eternity in suburbia. The entire street had come outside to watch the free entertainment. Neighbors were standing on their porches, pretending to check their mail, watering plants that didn't need water. And as one of the officers casually asked his partner to radio in the false alarm, every single set of eyes on the street drifted across the asphalt to the exact same address. Linda's house. She was standing in her window. Even from a distance, I could see her rigid posture deflate just a fraction. Now, I want to be incredibly clear about what I did next, because it is the foundation of everything that followed. Most people would have marched across that street. They would have pounded on her heavy oak door. They would have screamed, demanded an apology, or immediately filed a counter-complaint for harassment. They would have let emotion dictate their strategy. I am not most people. I spent a decade identifying systemic flaws in multi-million-dollar corporations. Anger is an inefficient emotion. It clouds judgment. Linda had just told me I invent problems that don't exist. It was time to find out if she was right. I didn't look at her window. I didn't say a word to the whispering neighbors. I simply turned around, walked inside my new house, and closed the door. I unpacked my coffee maker, brewed a painfully average cup of dark roast, and sat down on a folding chair in an empty living room. Sitting right there on the kitchen counter was a thick, glossy folder that had been left on my doorstep earlier that morning. The official HOA welcome packet. I opened it. I bypassed the paint swatches and the trash collection schedules. I pulled out the neighborhood maps. It was beautifully printed, detailing every lot, every common area, every boundary. To a normal person, it was just lines on paper. But I had just spent 3 agonizing weeks reviewing raw property documents, land surveys, and county records during the purchase process. My brain is permanently wired to spot anomalies in data sets. I took a sip of my coffee, tracing the boundary lines of the main street with my finger. It wasn't dramatic. There were no glaring red flags that would jump out at a casual reader. But something was fundamentally wrong. The formatting, the property lines connected to the street, they felt completely inconsistent with the dense legal files I had scrutinized at the county office. It was a tiny discrepancy, the kind of thing everyone, for decades, would dismiss as a simple printing error. But I had just been treated like a criminal on my own lawn. And when you force a data analyst to question if they belong in a neighborhood, they don't just get mad. They start digging. The following week, I found myself standing under the flickering, aggressively sterile fluorescent lights of the county records office. If my new HOA was a monument to superficial control and manicured lawns, this place was a graveyard of forgotten bureaucracy. It smelled faintly of industrial floor wax, stale coffee, and decaying paper. I approached the front counter. Behind it sat a clerk who looked like he had been permanently attached to his rolling chair since the invention of the filing cabinet. His name tag said Gary. Gary was not interested in my quest for neighborhood truth. When I requested the historical property files, original subdivision surveys, and development agreements going back to the neighborhood's original platting, Gary let out a sigh so profound it practically rustled the stacks of paper on his desk. "Those are in the physical archives, buddy," Gary muttered, barely looking up from his monitor. "It's going to take 3 to 5 business days to pull them. Maybe longer. We're short-staffed, and those boxes are heavy." Most people would have accepted that. They would have politely thanked Gary, gone home, lost their momentum, and eventually let the HOA's petty tyranny win. But in corporate risk assessment, you learn a fundamental truth. Bureaucratic resistance is rarely a solid brick wall. It is usually just a very heavy, poorly maintained gate. You just need to know exactly which rusty hinge to press. I didn't get angry. I leaned against the counter, perfectly relaxed, and spoke his language. I casually mentioned that I was conducting an independent compliance audit regarding a potential title defect, one that might heavily implicate the county's liability in a massive, unresolved zoning and tax dispute. It was entirely true, but wrapped in just enough administrative jargon to trigger a public employee's deepest survival instinct. Gary's eyes widened a fraction. The magic words, county liability. 20 minutes later, Gary was wheeling out a squeaky metal cart groaning under the weight of 3 massive, dust-covered ledger boxes. "Table 4 is open," he mumbled, suddenly very eager to distance himself from whatever legal grenade I was about to unpin. I spread the documents across the scratched wooden reading table. To anyone else, it would have been a terrifying, sleep-inducing mountain of legal gibberish and faded ink. To me, it was a forensic playground. This is exactly what I spent a decade doing. I looked for the loose thread in the corporate sweater. I sat down, opened the first box, and spent the next 4 hours going through them, page by page, cross-referencing dates, signatures, and plat numbers. The first hour yielded nothing but zoning approvals. The second hour made my eyes burn from reading tiny architectural print. But in the third hour, a pattern began to emerge. A very quiet, very expensive pattern. When a developer builds a neighborhood, there is a standard sequence of events. They buy the raw land, they subdivide it into lots, they pave the roads, and then, crucially, they legally transfer the ownership of those common areas, like the main street, to the newly formed homeowners association. It requires a specific set of filings, a documented chain of custody. I traced that chain. I found the initial platting agreements from decades ago. I found the official incorporation documents for the HOA. I found the preliminary paperwork showing the intent to transfer the road infrastructure. But I couldn't find the execution document. I stopped. I drank some tepid water from my thermos. I checked the folder again. I checked the cross-references. I went back to the front desk and had Gary pull the microfiche back up. I sat in front of that glowing screen until my vision blurred, manually scanning decades of county filings. Nothing. The final, binding legal document that actually transferred ownership of the neighborhood's main street from the original developer to the HOA simply did not exist. At some point in the distant past, the developer had initiated the paperwork, and someone, somewhere, had just assumed it was finished. That massive, foundational assumption had been inherited by every single subsequent HOA board. For decades, presidents like Linda had been marching up and down that street, assessing fines, enforcing absurd rules, and acting like suburban warlords on a piece of asphalt they technically did not own. Nobody had ever bothered to look. Nobody had ever verified the primary sources. They just acted like they owned it, and everyone blindly believed them. I sat back in my hard plastic chair, staring at the empty space where a deed should have been. The sheer audacity of the incompetence was breathtaking. The HOA's entire authority over that street was built on a ghost document. But a missing piece of paper wasn't enough. In the world of risk analysis, a theory is just a hallucination until it is backed by empirical, undeniable proof. A defensive HOA lawyer could look at this and claim it was merely a clerical artifact that could be easily dismissed in court. I needed a weapon that could not be argued with at a community meeting. I packed up my notes, walked out into the bright afternoon sun, and pulled out my phone. I didn't call an attorney. Not yet. Attorneys argue about the law. I needed someone who dealt in absolute, physical reality. I needed a licensed land surveyor. Because if the county records were right, the street I lived on was legally unattached, floating in a jurisdictional void. And I had a very specific, perfectly legal idea of exactly how to fill that void. In the business of risk analysis, there is a distinct difference between finding a loophole and successfully exploiting it. A missing document in a dusty county archive is a theory. To turn it into a weapon, you need empirical data. 3 days later, that empirical data arrived in my neighborhood driving a battered white Ford pickup. His name was Marcus. He was a licensed commercial land surveyor, a man who possessed zero interest in neighborhood politics, acceptable grass heights, or HOA drama. Marcus operated strictly in the realm of satellite GPS, laser levels, and buried iron property pins. I handed him my research file and a very generous retainer. His mandate was simple: verify the historical boundaries of the neighborhood, specifically the legal dimensions and ownership status of the main street. The disruption to the neighborhood's pristine aesthetic was immediate. Marcus and his assistant didn't wear matching pastel polos. They wore neon orange safety vests. They didn't quietly observe. They set up a massive, bright yellow robotic total station right in the middle of the street. They spray-painted tiny, neon pink reference dots on the pristine asphalt. They began driving wooden stakes into the ground near the common area curbs. It took exactly 14 minutes for the neighborhood surveillance network to activate. I was standing in my driveway, drinking coffee, watching Marcus operate his equipment, when the familiar, aggressive click-clack of sensible heels echoed across the pavement. It was Linda. She was practically vibrating with indignation, a clipboard tightly gripped to her chest like a shield. She didn't address me first. She marched straight up to Marcus, who was currently squinting through a specialized lens. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice echoing off the brick facades of the surrounding houses. "Who authorized you to dig up HOA property? I need to see your vendor clearance and your liability insurance immediately." Marcus didn't even flinch. He slowly stood up, adjusted his hard hat, and looked at her with the blank, exhausted expression of a man who dealt with angry property owners for a living. "I don't need vendor clearance, ma'am. I'm operating on a public right-of-way. This is a private, gated-style community," Linda snapped, her face flushing a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "This street is owned and maintained by the Homeowners Association. I am the president. You will pack up this equipment right now, or I am calling the police." It was the perfect opening. I took a slow sip of my coffee and stepped off my driveway onto the asphalt. "Actually, Linda, I wouldn't do that," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and conversational. She whipped her head toward me, her eyes narrowing. I should have known. What exactly is your game here?" "No game," I replied calmly. "You told me on moving day that I invent problems that don't exist. So, I decided to look into the things that do exist, like the deed to this street. You know, the document that proves the HOA actually owns the ground we are standing on. Linda crossed her arms, adopting her default posture of absolute authority. The HOA has owned this infrastructure since 1998. It is clearly outlined in the bylaws. Bylaws aren't deeds, Linda, I said, stepping just a fraction closer. Bylaws are just rules you wrote for yourselves. I spent the last week at the county records office. The developer never actually transferred the title of this street to the association. You've been policing, fining, and managing a piece of real estate that legally doesn't belong to you. For a second, the carefully constructed facade of the neighborhood dictator cracked. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The absolute certainty in her eyes wavered, replaced by a sudden, terrifying flash of institutional panic. That is absurd, she finally sputtered, though the volume of her voice had dropped significantly. It's a clerical error, a minor formatting issue. I am contacting our legal counsel. You should, I agreed politely. Make sure they look for the original transfer execution from Phase 1 of the platting. Spoiler alert, they won't find it. She didn't argue further. She spun around and power-walked back to her house, her posture rigid, her phone already pressed to her ear. By sunset, the rumor mill had reached critical mass. In a community where people usually gossiped about unauthorized fence paint, the news that the HOA might not actually own the neighborhood streets was the equivalent of a nuclear detonation. Linda went into immediate, desperate damage control. She slid an aggressively worded flyer into every mailbox, calling for an emergency HOA meeting the following Tuesday. The flyer assured residents that a disgruntled new homeowner was spreading baseless legal fiction, and that the board would comprehensively debunk these claims. It was a classic corporate cover-up tactic. When the facts are against you, you attack the whistleblower's credibility. Tuesday night arrived. The meeting was held in the local community center. Usually, these meetings drew maybe 6 board retirees complaining about trash pickup. Tonight, it was standing room only. The air was thick with tension, nervous whispers, and the smell of cheap folding chairs. Linda sat at the front table, flanked by 2 very nervous-looking board members. She had a massive stack of papers in front of her. She banged a small wooden gavel, an actual gavel, and launched into a defensive monologue. She talked about history, about community values, about how an outside agitator was trying to destroy their peace. She talked for 15 minutes. She said absolutely nothing of legal substance. When she finally paused for breath, a man who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years stood up. He didn't look at Linda. He looked at me, sitting quietly in the back row. Well, the man said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. Is it true? Do we own the street or not? I didn't give a speech. I didn't gloat. I simply stood up, unzipped my leather binder, and began passing out thick, neatly stapled packets. I had printed 50 copies. I'm not going to ask you to take my word for it. I addressed the room, my voice steady, projecting the exact tone I used when briefing a board of directors on a catastrophic financial loss. In this packet, you will find the original 1998 subdivision surveys. You will find the development agreements. And on page 4, you will find the county clerk's formal confirmation that the transfer of the main thoroughfare was never executed. The room went dead silent, save for the sound of 50 people flipping heavy pages. I hired an independent surveyor. I continued. His preliminary findings matched the county records. The street is unattached. The HOA has been enforcing rules, towing cars, and collecting maintenance fees for an asset it does not legally possess. I watched Linda's face drain of color as the residents, her subjects, her neighbors, stared at the undeniable, documented truth in their hands. The murmurs started again, this time louder, angrier, and directed entirely at the front table. But as the room descended into chaotic arguing, I sat back down and quietly closed my empty binder. I hadn't told them the most important part yet. Exposing the flaw was just the audit. What I did at the county courthouse 3 hours before this meeting, that was the acquisition. In the corporate world, when you find an abandoned, highly valuable asset floating in a legal gray area, you don't just point it out to the board of directors. You don't ask for permission to fix it. You acquire it. I let the chaotic arguing in the community center run its course for another 3 minutes. I watched neighbors who had silently endured years of petty fines finally turn on the board. I watched Linda desperately bang her little wooden gavel, a hollow sound that was completely ignored by the very people she used to terrify. But exposing her fake kingdom wasn't the goal. Removing the risk was. I stood up again. The room didn't quiet down immediately, But as I walked slowly toward the front table, the arguments began to fade. I didn't have a thick packet this time. I just had a single, crisp sheet of paper. It wasn't a dusty historical record. It didn't smell like the county archives. It smelled like fresh printer ink, and it carried a bright blue validation stamp dated that exact afternoon. 3 hours before this meeting, I said, my voice cutting through the lingering murmurs. My property attorney and I sat down with a representative of the original development group's defunct holding company. The entity that, legally speaking, still held the residual rights to the street because the HOA never finished their paperwork 25 years ago. I stopped directly in front of Linda's table. She wasn't glaring anymore. She was staring at the piece of paper in my hand with the wide, unblinking eyes of a prey animal that just realized it was caught in a trap it couldn't see. Since we established that the association doesn't own the asphalt, I continued, projecting to the back of the room. I felt it was necessary to permanently resolve the liability issue. For a nominal legal fee and a properly executed quitclaim deed, the holding company formally transferred the infrastructure rights. I slid the paper across the folding table. It stopped right next to her gavel. They didn't transfer it to the HOA, Linda. They transferred it to me. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that only happens when an entire hierarchy collapses in real time. As of 2:15 p.m. today, I stated, locking eyes with her, I am the sole, registered legal owner of the main thoroughfare of this neighborhood. Which means, effectively immediately, the Homeowners Association has absolutely zero legal jurisdiction over street parking, towing enforcement, or vehicular access. Linda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The clipboard she had been clutching slid from her fingers and hit the floor with a sharp clatter. All the rules she had memorized, all the threats she had issued, all the power she had hoarded, evaporated in an instant. She was no longer the dictator of the neighborhood. She was simply a resident, living on a street owned by the very man she had tried to have arrested on his first day. The aftermath wasn't explosive. It was profoundly, beautifully quiet. The neighborhood settled almost immediately. Uncertainty, it turns out, is what creates tension. Once the facts were documented and the ultimate authority was stripped from the people abusing it, the atmosphere completely changed. The petty citations stopped. The threatening letters ceased. Linda and I have had incredibly civil, brief conversations since that night. She doesn't look at my lawn anymore. She doesn't ask questions. A few weeks after the final paperwork cleared the county system, several neighbors who had watched that initial police interaction from their driveways came over. We had a casual get-together near the water. Nobody talked about bylaws. Nobody checked the height of the grass. It was exactly the kind of peaceful evening that makes you remember why you spent a decade saving for a house in the first place. Later that night, I sat on my dock, looking out at the water, thinking about the alternate timeline. The version of this story where I write off Linda's aggression as quirky behavior. The version where I get scared by the police, put my head down, and submit to the micro-dictatorship. That version exists. Millions of people live in it every day. But if you want to survive a rigged system, you can't just follow their rules. You have to read the documents they didn't.